Hi guys, welcome back to my channel and welcome to today's tutorial video. Today's video I'm going to show you my tips and techniques on rendering a realistic looking squirrel like the one that I've drawn here. So let's get straight into this tutorial, and one of the first things that you need to make sure that you have is a completely accurate outline, and how you get that outline is up to you. Personally, I like to use the grid method, but you can trace, you can freehand. Obviously tracing is going to give you the most accurate outline, so if you're not comfortable outlining with a grid or freehand and you want to make sure that you have everything accurate, then I would recommend tracing your outline to begin with. Once you've got that initial sketch and that really accurate outline, it's then so much easier to add all of the details and everything in. If you're a regular on my channel and you watch a lot of the tutorials, you'll know that I like to start with the eyes, and the eye of the squirrel is really beady. It's a bit like a bird's eye. It's quite dark. There's not very much definition. You don't have to worry about adding a pupil or too much colour or anything. It's mainly just the outline of it and the highlight, so the reflective part of the eye. So I've made sure that I've got that down with a really sharp dark sepia pencil. I've mainly used dark sepia to add the actual darkness and the depth of the eye. And all I've done is just lightly built up the pressure. I've gone in with a sharp pencil and light pressure to begin with to just get that initial shape of the eye, and then I've gone in and really put some more pressure onto my pencil and added multiple layers to really get the depth and the darkness that I need within the eye there. For the highlight on the eye, I've literally just gone around the highlight with that dark sepia pencil, mapped out the shapes and everything which I can see in the reference picture, and then I've gone in and added some blue tones to the eye there. I've also added a little bit of purple. So the colours which I used in this eye to create the highlight were sky blue from the Polychromos and manganese violet from the Polychromos. So I've mainly used those two pencils and then toned it with a little bit of a warm grey pencil as well. So the tones and the colour of a red squirrel is obviously orange, red, and there's also a little bit of purple in there. So the colour palette which I picked out for this mainly consisted of oranges, a few browns, a little bit of red, and then a purple colour. And for the purple highlights on this squirrel, I used manganese violet. And as I've mentioned in previous videos, when you add purple to orange, it really complements it, it really adds a vibrancy to it. So I always like to pick out those types of colours. So they're the colours on the colour wheel which kind of complement each other or contrast each other, whichever way you want to look at it. So the fur and everything on the face and the body of the squirrel is actually really quite short. So the technique which I've used there is just put down a base layer. For my base layer I've used a warm grey one, and all I've done is just shaded that. So literally all I've done is put minimal pressure onto my pencil and just used a back and forth motion with my pencil in the direction that the fur's going in. So I've really paid attention to that reference photo. I've looked at the way that the fur's going around the eye, around the nose, as it comes up towards the ears and everything. I've looked at that reference photo, I've mapped that out in my mind and then applied it with the base layer to my drawing. So I've used really light pressure, a sharp pencil, and just worked in the direction that that fur is going in. And that's really important that you pay attention to the fur direction, because that's what's going to make this look realistic. If you was to have fur that was coming off at odd angles, it would kind of look a little bit odd and it would really stick out and it wouldn't make it look natural. So you want to make sure that you pay attention to the reference photo or whatever you're using as reference, and you map the fur out in the correct direction. So I've gone in with that base layer of the warm grey one, and then I've built up the tones on the squirrel with some yellow. So I've used light yellow ochre, and I've used some cadmium orange, some burnt ochre and terracotta, and I've built those colours up working from the lightest to the darkest. So the lightest colour obviously being the yellow, and then the darkest colour being the terracotta, and these colours are all from the Polychromos as well, in case you're wondering. So I've just built up from the lightest to the darkest and just built up that fur texture, initially using some shading with the yellow, and as I've got more towards the darker colours, I've started to incorporate some fur lines. So what I've done is just made really short, sharp marks with my pencil. Using a sharp pencil is key here as well, and I've just added some lines onto some of those shading layers, and it's really built up the fur texture to this really short, kind of silky looking fur that you can see on the face. I've then gone in with some of the darker colours, so I've built up my light tones and my mid values, so now I've gone in with those darker values to add the shadow and shading. So those darkest parts are mainly underneath the eye and around the nose, and that's where the bone structure on the squirrel is actually more sort of sunken in, so you've got those more shadowy areas. So all I've done to add that in is just use my darker colours. So in my case I used burnt sienna, some Caput Molten Violet and some walnut brown, and all I've done is just shaded and use the same technique as those base layers to get that initial colour down. So in some places, especially around the nose, I needed to get quite a dark colour down, so I've just gone in and shaded to begin with, and then I've gone in with those real darker colours, so the walnut brown, and added some fur lines and sort of blended everything out. So when you're adding the shadows to the face where you've got those darker spots, you need to make sure that you do blend into your surrounding areas, and that's really important as well, because in nature everything is sort of blended. There's no real sort of harsh lines or anything, so you need to make sure that you blend all of your colours into the surrounding areas. And to do that, all I did was just lessened the pressure on my pencil as I went into the lighter areas, and it just sort of blended together, just using a shading technique and using some fur lines as well. The fur lines is really important because that also helps to get that really realistic smooth blend between two areas. So for the ears and the back of the squirrel, I just applied exactly the same technique as what I was doing on the face, used the shading method for those base colours and those light colours as well, and then just slowly built up to my darker colours and added those fur lines and that definition within the fur. Then it came to do the tail, and the tail was a completely different texture to the body and the face of the squirrel. So a squirrel's tail is really lovely and fluffy, it's really light in texture, it just looks really kind of cuddly. So when you're drawing long fur, in this case for the tail of the squirrel, you need to change the technique of how you do your fur strokes and how you add your base layers. So the base layers and everything for the tail, I added in longer strokes. So you've got that shorter fur on the face and the body, which I used some shorter lines for, but for the tail where it's longer and fluffier, I used a much longer and broader shading stroke for the tail. I added the base layer in exactly the same way though. I just shaded back and forth. I worked in the direction that that tail fluff was going in and just added that down really lightly with a sharp warm grey 1 pencil, and then I used the same process of building from my lighter colours to my darker colours, and I used exactly the same method, just shading, but making sure that those shading strokes were much longer than the ones that I used in the face and the body. And when it came to doing the more defined lines, so using a sharp pencil with the darker colours and adding in that really kind of defined darker fur within a tail, instead of making short marks with the pencil, so almost like pinprick marks, I made longer strokes. So I made the strokes really long and followed the length of the tail. So you can see this as I demonstrate on the top of the tail. I just used really kind of long flowing strokes to work from where the sort of bone structure within the tail was towards the tip of the tail, and that helps to create that really sort of fluffy soft texture. Around the outside of the tail you've got these really sort of fluffy, almost like straggly looking hairs, and to do that, instead of shading those, I added some individual fur lines coming off of the edge. If I was to go in and shade those, it would look really too bulky, it would look too dense. So adding those individual fur lines coming off of the edge just helps to make it look really, really soft and really fluffy and light. So as I worked down the rest of the tail towards the feet, it got a lot darker and I didn't really need to introduce a lot of those lighter colours. So sometimes when I'm drawing a piece, when I have something that's really quite dark, I don't tend to add those lighter colours in there. So what I do is just to add a base layer. So I use the initial colour of the warm grey 1, but then I go in with the mid-tones and the darker values. So I don't bother adding in any of like the yellows or the lighter oranges. I go straight in with the mid-tones. So for the darker parts towards the base of the tail, I basically just went in with the burnt sienna, terracotta, walnut brown, all of those sort of darker mid-tone values, and built those up from there. If I was to go in with some of the lighter colours initially on those darker areas, it would build up too many layers and I would have difficulty adding some of the details in, especially with the way that I work, because I like to burnish a little bit with the pencil as I go. So by not adding those lighter colours in there, it enabled me to get that really sort of dark, richer colour that I really wanted to get within those darker areas. I then worked across the body and I applied exactly the same technique as I did to the face. I went in with those base layers and then I started to add the darker colours and slowly building up to add some of those fur lines. and I just worked in the direction that that fur is going in. I built up the darker values, the lighter values. I added the tone and shaded the darker colours where you had those sort of really dark areas. That was mainly around the base of the tail and the bottom of where the feet are sitting on the moss and everything. So I just worked in exactly the same way that I demonstrated on the face there. The trickiest part of this portrait was actually the hands. Now, this isn't something that I come across very often in wildlife pieces, and I haven't really tackled hands or this kind of texture or anything in depth, so this was a little bit challenging for me, but I just followed the same rules that I applied to all of my work, and that is to just map out everything, map the sort of darker areas using really light pressure. So what I did was just added a base layer of the warm grey one, and then I mapped out the individual fingers with some light pressure with some burnt ochre, and then went in with some walnut brown and sort of separated where each finger was. And I worked in that way just by building up my tones and values that way and just using my observation of the reference photo. One tip which I can give you here is to be patient. Patience is absolutely key when you're drawing something that you're not really comfortable with. Just take your time with it, just analyse your reference photo or whatever you're working from and slowly build your coloured pencil layers. Try not to rush it, and if you get frustrated, make sure that you take a little break from it as well. So for the pink tones in the hands and also in the nose, I didn't cover that in the very beginning, I didn't actually pick out a pink colour to use for this portrait. I actually had a quite dark red, but I also had a white pencil, and to make that really light pink colour, what I did is just shaded really lightly with my red pencil, and then I went over with my white pencil and burnished it out, and I got this really lovely pink colour, and I think it ended up working extremely well. I also toned a little bit with that violet and also blended out with the white a little bit more, and I managed to get quite a variety of tones just by using those 3 pencils. The best part of this portrait for me was actually the white fur. That is something that I am completely comfortable with, so adding that white fur on the belly was a dream, and all I did for that was just added in that base layer. So for all of this portrait I used that warm grey one for the base layer. I added that down, I mapped out the direction that that fur was going in on that belly, and then I went in with another layer of the warm grey one and mapped in those darker areas, so I increased the pressure on my pencil a little bit more and just mapped out those darker areas, and then I went in with the warm grey 3 pencil and really started to darken everything up. I also added a few highlights of purple, so I used the manganese violet and the sky blue just to add a little bit of interest and sort of contrast to the belly fur there. I also added some yellow and blended that out with the white pencil as well to create a nice creamy colour. And then of course I went in with some of my darker colours, so I went in with some walnut brown and added a little bit of shading around by the feet and around the side of the leg as well. So that's just a quick summary and demonstration of some of the techniques and tips that I have used throughout this portrait. If you want to watch this in more depth and real time, there is a full 5-hour tutorial available on my Patreon page for $10 subscribers, and also on my website for subscribers over there as well. So if you're interested in following along in real time, make sure you take a look over there. So hopefully the few short tips and techniques here have helped you to apply these to your own work. Perhaps you had a similar sort of texture with the fluffy tail and you was a little bit unsure of how to approach it, so hopefully my short demonstration of tips here with the fluffy tail has helped you, and any other parts within the squirrel as well. If you're new around here and you like this video, make sure you hit that subscribe button because I upload art tutorials every single week. Next week we've got a fur tutorial, so if you're interested in learning some more techniques about fur, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss that tutorial next week. But anyway guys, I hope you enjoyed this one and I will see you in my next video. Bye!